In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a single glass of sherry shatters on the vicarage floor, and Reginald Forbes collapses, gasping poison. The genteel bridge club where secrets are bid as boldly as cards becomes a stage for murder. Was it the vicar, hiding a shameful past? The doctor, stung by a patient's scorn? The wealthy widow, haunted by stolen jewels? Or the colonel, burned by wartime betrayal? As Miss Jane Marple's keen eyes unravel a web of blackmail and deceit, a shocking truth emerges: the killer's hand was played not to murder, but to diet the wrong card turned fatal. Who dealt this deadly trick, and what hidden twist waits in the shadows? Chapter 1. The gathering storming the drowsy hamlet of St. Mary Mead, where the thatched cottages nestled like contented hens under the late summer sun. Life moved at a pace that suited its inhabitants, slow, deliberate, and laced with the gentle hum of routine. The village, with its single winding street, a post office that doubled as a gossip hub, and a church whose bells tolled with reassuring regularity, was a place where secrets were as common as blackbirds, though rarely as fleeting. On Thursday evenings, the vicarage became the heart of the village's modest social whirl. Hosting the St. Mary Mead Bridge Club, it was here, in the oak-panelled drawing room of Reverend Simon Harrington, that Miss Jane Marple found herself. On a sultry August evening, her knitting needles clicking softly, her pale blue eyes darting with the precision of a hawk over the assembled players, Miss Marple, a slight figure with snow-white hair tucked neatly under a laced cap, was a fixture. In St. Mary Mead, as much a part of its fabric as the ancient yew in the churchyard. To the casual observer, she was merely a spinster of advanced years, her hands perpetually occupied with wool and needles, her conversation peppered with village anecdotes. But those who knew her well, and few did, understood that beneath her gentle demeanor lay a mind as sharp as a newly honed scythe, capable of slicing through the tangled webs of human behavior. She had seen much in her long life, from the petty jealousies of parlor maids to the darker sins that lurked behind lace curtains, and she had learned that no village, however idyllic, was immune to the currents of malice that ran through the human heart. The vicarage drawing room was aglow with the soft light of oil lamps, their flames casting flickering shadows on the walls adorned with faded watercolors of pastoral scenes. The air carried the faint scent of lavender, polish, and old books, mingled with the sharper temps of sherry from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. The bridge table, a sturdy mahogany affair, stood at the center, its green baize surface worn from years of play. Around it sat the evening's players, each a distinct thread in the village's tapestry, their interactions a delicate dance of civility and suppressed rivalry. Reverend Simon Harrington, a man of middle years with a stoop that suggested a lifetime of bending to others' troubles, presided over the gathering with his usual diffidence. His mild brown eyes, framed by wire spectacles, betrayed a nervousness that belied his clerical calm. He was a poor bridge player, prone to timid bids and apologetic smiles, but his hospitality was unmatched, and his homemade elderflower cordial was a village legend. Tonight, however, his hands trembled slightly as he arranged the cards, a fact Miss Marple noted with a flicker of interest. She recalled a similar tremor in the hands of Mr. Pemberley, the grocer, before he confessed to pilfering from his own till. Opposite the vicar sat Dr. Lionel Ellis, the village physician, a wiry man with a sharp jaw and sharper tongue. His grey hair was cropped close, and his eyes, a piercing green, seemed to dissect his opponents as thoroughly as he did his patients. Dr. Ellis played bridge with the precision of a surgeon, his bids calculated and his manner brusque. He had little patience for errors, and his caustic remarks had been known to reduce weaker players to silence. Miss Marple, who had once watched him stitch a farmhand's wound with the same intensity he now applied to a trump suit, planned to bid. To spades, he snapped at Mrs. Price, who had hesitated over a finesse. "You might have taken the trick." His voice carried a note of disdain that Miss Marple found oddly familiar, reminiscent of a schoolmaster she had known in her youth, whose bark was far worse than his bite. Mrs. Lavinia Price, a widow of considerable means, occupied the third chair. Her late husband, a tea merchant who had amassed a fortune in the Far East, had left her with a grand house on the edge of the village and a reputation for extravagance. Her auburn hair, only lightly touched with grey, was swept into an elegant chignon, and her silk dress rustled softly as she leaned forward to study her cards. She played bridge with a flair that bordered on recklessness, her bids bold and her laughter bright. Though Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of unease beneath her polished exterior, Mrs. Price's wealth had made her a target of envy, and her past was rumoured to hold shadows, debts unpaid, promises broken. Miss Marple, who had once unravelled the mystery of a stolen brooch at a church bazaar, knew that wealth often attracted trouble as moths to a flame. The fourth player was Colonel Bantry, a retired army man whose ruddy complexion and bristling moustache gave him the air of a bygone era. He was younger than most colonels, having left the service early after an unspecified incident abroad, and his return to St. Mary Mead with his vivacious wife, Dolly, had set tongues wagging. The colonel played bridge with a soldier's discipline, though his bold declarations often outstripped his skill. His wife, Dolly Bantry, sat beside him, her blonde curls bouncing as she chatted animatedly. Dolly was a creature of fashion, her dresses cut in the latest London style, her laughter a touch too loud. She was not a regular player, preferring to flit about the room, offering tea or commentary, but tonight she had taken a seat at Miss Marple's insistence. "You must join us, Dolly," Miss Marple had said, her tone gentle but firm. Sensing the young woman's restlessness, the final figure in the room was Mr. Reginald Forbes, a newcomer to St. Mary Mead, who had taken up residence in Rose Cottage. Only a month prior, a businessman from London, he was a tall man with sleek dark hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His tailored suits and polished manners marked him as an outsider, and his tales of city dealing stocks, shares, and shadowy ventures intrigued and unsettled the villagers. Forbes had declined to play that evening, citing a headache, but he lingered by the sideboard, his long fingers toying with a glass of sherry. "I'll observe tonight," he had said, his voice smooth as polished oak. "One learns more by watching." Miss Marple, who had once deduced a theft from the way a maid avoided her gaze, noted the way Forbes' eyes lingered on each player, as if tallying their worth. The evening began with the usual pleasantries. Reverend Harrington offered his cordial, which Mrs. Price declined in favour of sherry, her glass catching the lamplight like a jewel. Dr. Ellis, ever the contrarian, chose water, muttering about the folly of sweet drinks. The Colonel and Dolly accepted the cordial, while Miss Marple sipped her customary tea, her cup balanced on a small table beside her knitting. The cards were dealt, and the first hand commenced. The players settling into their roles, Harrington cautious, Ellis aggressive, Mrs. Price flamboyant, and Bantry resolute. Forbes, from his vantage point, offered occasional commentary, his tone light but edged with condescension. "A bolder bid might have served you better, Vicar," he remarked after a lost trick. Earning a tight smile from Harrington, Miss Marple content to let the game unfold, watched the interplay with quiet interest. She had always found bridge a mirror of human nature, its partnerships revealing loyalties and tensions as clearly as any confession. The vicar's hesitancy, she mused, was not unlike that of Mrs. Carter, who had once dithered over a recipe to hide her pilfering of parish funds. Dr. Ellis's sharpness recalled a solicitor who had bullied his way through a village dispute, only to be undone by a forged letter. Mrs. Price's bravado was reminiscent of a stage actress who had charmed her way into a stolen inheritance, while the Colonel's bluster brought to mind a poacher who had boasted of his catches until caught himself. Dolly's chatter, meanwhile, echoed a shopgirl who had talked her way out of trouble, only to talk herself back into it. As the first rubber progressed, the atmosphere thickened. Forbes' remarks grew bolder, his smile sharper. "You might have led with hearts, Mrs. Price," he said, leaning forward, his sherry glass glinting. "A safer suit." Mrs. Price's eyes flashed, but she laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I prefer to take risks, Mr. Forbes," she replied, her voice honeyed but cold. Dr. Ellis snorted, discarding a card with unnecessary force. "Risks without strategy are folly," he muttered, and Miss Marple noted the flush in his cheeks. So like the butcher who had argued with a customer before a knife went missing. The Colonel, meanwhile, grew testy, his bids growing reckless as Forbes critiqued his play. "I've faced worse odds in the field," he growled, slamming down a card. Dolly, attempting to lighten the mood, laughed and patted his arm. "Oh, Arthur, it's only a game." But her eyes darted to Forbes, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease, akin to a governess who had feared her secrets exposed. The game paused briefly as Forbes rose to refill his sherry. "I'll fetch it myself," he said, waving off Dolly's offer to pour. He crossed to the sideboard, his movements fluid, almost theatrical. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched him, her mind drifting to a conjurer she had once seen at a fair, whose sleight of hand had hidden more than tricks. Forbes returned, glass in hand, and the game resumed, the tension now palpable. The players' voices grew sharper, their bids more contentious. Reverend Harrington fumbled a card, earning a TSK from Forbes. "Precision vicar," he said, his tone almost mocking. Harrington's smile was strained, his fingers twitching. As the final hand of the rubber approached, the room seemed to hold its breath. The bids climbed to spades, 3 hearts, a daring phenotrum from Mrs. Price, countered by Dr. Ellis's 5 clubs. The Colonel hesitated, then doubled, his jaw set. Forbes chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "A bold move," he murmured, sipping his sherry. The play was fierce, tricks won and lost with growing intensity. Accusations flew. Mrs. Price claimed Dr. Ellis had signalled improperly, while the Colonel grumbled about Harrington's weak lead. Dolly, caught in the crossfire, laughed nervously, her hands fluttering like moths. Then, as the final trick was claimed, a gasp broke the silence. Forbes, who had risen to toast the winner, clutched his throat, his face contorting. The sherry glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. "Poison, ... The sherry," he rasped, his voice a choked whisper. He staggered, his eyes wide with accusation, then collapsed, his body crumpling like a discarded hand of cards. Dolly screamed, the Colonel swore, and Dr. Ellis sprang forward, his medical instincts overriding his shock. But it was too late. Reginald Forbes' system. Forbes was dead. The room erupted into chaos. Reverend Harrington dropped to his knees beside the fallen man, his prayers drowned out by Dolly's cries. Dr. Ellis barked orders, loosening Forbes' collar and checking his pulse, his face grim. Mrs. Price stood frozen, her cards scattered. Across the table, Colonel Bantry gripped his wife's shoulder, his military bearing faltering as he stared at the body. Miss Marple alone remained seated, her knitting needles still, her eyes fixed on Forbes' lifeless form. "Dear me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. How very like old Mr. Pritchard. The Pritchard case, as Miss Marple recalled, had been a poisoning, too, though the poison had been arsenic, slipped into a teacup at a village fete. The similarities were striking, but so were the differences. Pritchard's death had been deliberate, the work of a jilted lover, whereas this... She frowned, her mind already sifting through the details. The sherry decanter sat untouched on the sideboard, yet Forbes had named it as his doom. Someone, she thought, had tampered with it, but who? Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his broad frame filling the doorway, his notebook already open. A man of action, he wasted no time, his questions sharp and relentless. Reverend Harrington admitted to filling the decanter that afternoon, but swore it had been untouched since. Mrs. Price revealed her late husband's business dealings with Forbes, none of them pleasant. Dr. Ellis disclosed prescribing for Forbes' supposed heart condition, a drug easily mistaken for poison in excess. The Colonel confessed to a quarrel with Forbes over investments, while Dolly claimed she had been in the kitchen fetching tea when the fatal moment occurred. Miss Marple knitted quietly, her mind turning over the scene. "It reminds me of poor Tommy Pierce," she said to herself, recalling a lad who had cheated at cards and paid a heavier price than he expected. The vicarage fell silent, save for Slack's barked questions and the soft weeping of Dolly Bantry. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a counterpoint to the chaos, as she pondered the darkness that had descended upon St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. The fatal hand of vicarage, so recently a haven of genteel competition, now bore the chill of tragedy. The oil lamps still cast their warm glow, but their light seemed to falter, as if reluctant to illuminate the grim scene on the floor. Reginald Forbes lay sprawled where he had fallen, his once impeccable suit rumpled, his face frozen in a rictus of shock. The shattered sherry glass glinted beside him, its contents seeping into the polished wood, leaving a dark stain that mirrored the mood of the room. The St. Mary Mead Bridge Club, momentarily united by horror, stood in disarray, their cards abandoned. On the green baize table, their voices hushed or shrill with disbelief, Miss Jane Marple remained in her corner, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail. She noted the way Reverend Harrington's hands shook as he rose from his futile prayers, his clerical collar slightly askew. Dr. Lionel Ellis, kneeling by the body, was methodically checking for signs of life, though his set jaw suggested he already knew the outcome. Mrs. Lavinia Price clutched her silk shawl, her face pale but composed, her eyes darting toward the sideboard where the sherry decanter stood. Colonel Arthur Bantry stood rigid, his arm around Dolly, who sobbed into a lace handkerchief, her blonde curls trembling. The air was thick with the scent of spilled sherry and fear, a combination Miss Marple found oddly reminiscent of a long ago incident involving a wayward curate and a bottle of port. Inspector Slack, bustling with the efficiency of a man who preferred action to reflection, had taken charge. His broad shoulders blocked the doorway as he issued orders to a young constable, who scurried to secure the room. "No one leaves," Slack barked, his voice cutting through Dolly's whimpers. and no one touches anything until I say so." His notebook was already filled with scribbled observations, his pencil moving as relentlessly as his questions. Miss Marple, overlooked as usual, watched him with a faint smile. She had dealt with Inspector Slack before, a man of vigor but limited imagination, much like the village blacksmith who could hammer iron but never shape it into anything delicate. Slack began his interrogations with the Reverend Harrington, whose nervous demeanor did little to inspire confidence. "I filled the decanter myself this afternoon," the vicar stammered, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "From a bottle in my study. It was sealed, I swear it. No one could have tampered with it." His voice faltered, and he glanced at the others, as if seeking confirmation. Miss Marple's needles twitched slightly in her lap, though she did not pick them up. She recalled a similar claim from Mrs. Eldridge, who had insisted her jam was untainted until the evidence proved otherwise. Next, Slack turned to Dr. Ellis, who rose from the body with a grimace. "He's gone," Ellis said brusquely. "Dead within minutes, I'd wager. Cyanosis, convulsions, classic signs of poisoning." His green eyes narrowed as Slack pressed him about the sherry. "I didn't touch the decanter," Ellis snapped. "I drank water tonight. You can check my glass." He gestured to a tumbler on the table, its contents clear and untouched. Slack made a note, then asked about Forbes' health. "He came to me last week, complaining of palpitations," Ellis admitted. "I prescribed digitalis, but only a small dose. Nothing that could do this." His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around his pen, much like a poacher she had once known. Caught with a snare in hand, Mrs. Price was questioned next, her composure a stark contrast to the vicar's unease. "I poured my own sherry," she said coolly, her auburn hair catching the lamplight, "from the decanter before the game began. If it was poisoned, I'd be dead too." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes were wary. Slack pressed her about her connection to Forbes. "My late husband knew him," she admitted. "They had dealings in Calcuttati imports. Not always amicable. But that was years ago." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted her shawl, reminiscent of a seamstress who had hidden stolen thread in her apron. Colonel Bantry's interrogation was brief but heated. "Forbes was a bounder," he growled, his moustache bristling. "We argued last week about some investments he pushed during the war. Said they'd make me a fortune, but they cost me plenty." His ruddy face darkened. "But I didn't kill him. I was at the table the whole time." Dolly, clinging to his arm, nodded vigorously. "Arthur never left my side," she said, her voice trembling. "I went to the kitchen for tea, but only for a moment." Slack raised an eyebrow, jotting down her words. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Dolly's flushed cheeks, recalling a housemaid who had blushed just so when questioned about a missing silver spoon. Forbes, final words, poison. The sherry hung over the room like a fog. Slack examined the decanter, sniffing its contents cautiously before sealing it for analysis. The broken glass beside Forbes was collected, its shards glinting ominously. Miss Marple watched as the constable bagged the evidence, her mind turning over the sequence of events. Forbes had poured his sherry himself, she recalled during a brief pause in the game. He had crossed to the sideboard, his movements deliberate, and returned with a full glass. Had someone tampered with it then, or earlier? She thought of a village fete where a tampered cake had caused a stir. The culprit revealed by a smudge of icing on a glove. The bridge table itself offered clues. The cards lay scattered, the final hand incomplete. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the score sheet, where Forbes had jotted the points before his collapse. The handwriting was bold, almost aggressive, unlike the vicar's neat script or Mrs. Price's elegant loops. She made a mental note to examine it later, remembering a forged note in the Enderby case that had unravelled a web of deceit. As Slack continued his questions, the player's nerves frayed. Reverend Harrington mopped his brow, muttering about the devil's work. Dr. Ellis paced, his impatience palpable. Mrs. Price sat rigidly, her eyes fixed on the decanter as if it might speak. The Colonel muttered under his breath, while Dolly's sobs subsided into sniffles. Miss Marple, unnoticed, let her thoughts drift to the village's undercurrents. Forbes had been an outsider, his arrival stirring whispers. Some said he was fleeing debts in London. Others hinted at darker secrets. His charm, she mused, was like that of a travelling salesman who had once swindled half the village before vanishing. The constable, a young man named Perkins, returned from searching Forbes' pockets. "Found this, sir," he said, handing Slack a crumpled letter. The inspector unfolded it, his eyes narrowing. "It's addressed to Forbes," he said, "from someone in London, demanding repayment of a loan. Sounds like he owed a fair bit." He glanced at the group, his gaze lingering on Mrs. Price. "Anyone know about this?" Heads shook, but Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Price's fingers tightened on her shawl, a gesture not unlike that of a widow who had once hidden a blackmail. Note: the night wore on, the vicarage growing colder as the lamps burned low. Slack dismissed the group with a warning to remain in the village, his suspicion clear. As the players dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the bridge table. "A curious game, bridge," she said softly to Reverend Harrington, who started. At her voice, it reveals so much about people, their boldness, their caution, their secrets. The vicar nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Miss Marple smiled, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. Forbes' death was no accident, she was certain, but the how and why remained elusive. As she stepped into the cool night air, her shawl drawn tight, she thought of a long-ago murder in St. Mary Mead, solved by a single misplaced word. "The truth," she murmured, "is often in the smallest details." Chapter 3. The inspector arrives. The night air of St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge as Inspector Slack's motorcar pulled up to the vicarage, its headlights cutting through the gathering mist like accusatory fingers. The village, usually asleep, by this hour stirred with unusual activity. Curtains twitched in nearby cottages, and whispers travelled faster than the wind. Inside the vicarage, the drawing room remained frozen in time. Reginald Forbes' body, covered now with a white sheet, borrowed from the linen cupboard, his presence a silent accusation amid the scattered cards and overturned chairs. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively in her armchair, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting untouched since the tragedy. She observed the group's frayed nerves with the quiet detachment of one who had witnessed human frailty in all its forms. Inspector Slack burst into the room like a storm, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards, his face set in lines of determined skepticism. A man in his 40s, with a bull-like build and a mustache that seemed perpetually bristled. Slack was known in the county for his brusque manner and his disdain for what he called village nonsense. He had crossed paths with Miss Marple before, dismissing her insights as the ramblings of an elderly spinster, only to find himself grudgingly proven wrong. Tonight, his eyes swept the room, cataloguing each face, the vicar's pallid anxiety, Dr. Ellis's impatient scowl, Mrs. Price's steely poise, Colonel Bantry's rigid stance, and Dolly's tear-streaked cheeks. "Right," he said, his voice booming. "Let's have the facts, and none of your embellishments." He began with a cursory examination of the body, lifting the sheet briefly before nodding to the constable to summon the police surgeon. "Poison, you say, in the sherry," his gaze fixed on the decanter, now guarded by young Perkins, who poured it. Hands pointed to Forbes himself, and Slack grunted, making notes in his battered book. Miss Marple watched him, her mind drifting to a similar scene years ago, when a visiting lecturer had collapsed at a garden party, his tea laced with something far deadlier than sugar. The interrogations commenced in earnest, Slack pacing the room like a caged animal. Reverend Harrington was first, his clerical collar seeming to choke him as he repeated his earlier statements. "I decanted the sherry at 4 o'clock, he said, his voice quavering, "from a new bottle. No one entered the study after that." Slack pressed him on visitors that day. Only the churchwarden, for a brief chat about the roof fund. Harrington, admitted, and well, Mr. Forbes dropped by unexpectedly. The room tensed. He wanted to discuss a charitable donation. The vicar hurried on, seemed in good spirits. Slack's eyes narrowed. "And you argued?" Harrington flushed. "A minor disagreement over theology." "Nothing more." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Theology, she knew, often masked deeper rifts, much like the quarrel between two sisters over a hymn book that had led to revelations of embezzlement. Dr. Ellis faced Slack's barrage next, his medical authority clashing with the inspector's bluntness. "Digitalis, for a heart condition," Slack echoed, flipping through his notes. Ellis nodded curtly. "He complained of irregular beats. I examined him, nothing serious, but I prescribed a low dose to steady him." The inspector leaned in and "Where's the bottle now?" Ellis patted his pockets, then frowned. "It was in my bag, but I must have left it unattended during the game." A murmur rippled through the group. Slack seized on it. Convenient. Anyone could have taken it. Ellis bristled. "I had no reason to harm him." Forbes was a patient, nothing more. But Miss Marple noted the doctor's evasive glance, reminiscent of a pharmacist who had once denied tampering with a prescription until confronted with evidence. Mrs. Lavinia Price met Slack's gaze unflinchingly, her widow's weeds lending her an air of dignified sorrow. "My husband dealt with Forbes in business," she confirmed. "There were ... discrepancies in accounts. But that was settled long ago." Slack produced the crumpled letter from Forbes' pocket. "This suggests otherwise. A demand for repayment." Mrs. Price's eyes widened fractionally. "I knew nothing of it." Her voice was steady, but her fingers twisted a ring on her hand. A habit Miss Marple, associated with a village matron who had concealed debts behind a facade of prosperity. Colonel Bantry's turn brought a spark of defiance. "Forbes was a cheat," he blustered. "Pushed bad investments during the war, lost me a packet." Slack raised an eyebrow. "Enough to kill him." The colonel's face reddened. "I confronted him, yes, but we parted civilly." Dolly interjected, her voice shaky. "Arthur was with me all evening." But Slack noted her brief absence to the kitchen. Time enough to slip something into the decanter. Dolly gasped. "I would never." Miss Marple observed Dolly's fluttering hands, so like those of a young bride who had hidden a lover's letters from her husband. As the questions dragged on, revelations trickled out. Forbes had been seen arguing with the vicar in the churchyard. Days earlier, their voices raised over past sins, Dr. Ellis admitted Forbes had questioned his diagnosis, accusing him of incompetence. Mrs. Price confessed to a letter from Forbes hinting at blackmail over her husband's shady dealings. The Colonel revealed a wartime scandal Forbes threatened to expose, while Dolly admitted Forbes' unwelcome attentions, his flirtations bordering on impropriety. Miss Marple questioned last and briefly offered little. "I saw nothing untoward," she said mildly, "but people are often not what they seem." Slack dismissed her with a grunt, turning to coordinate with the arriving surgeon. As the body was prepared for removal, Miss Marple's mind whirred. The poison, she mused, might not be digitalis. At all Forbes' symptoms suggested something swifter, like cyanide and the sherry. Perhaps a diversion. She recalled a case where a poisoned chalice had masked a needle prick. The true method hidden in plain sight. The group dispersed into the dawn, warnings ringing in their ears. Miss Marple walked home slowly, the village awakening around her. "Human nature," she murmured, "is a tangled hand indeed." The inspector might chase obvious leads, but she sensed deeper currents, motives intertwined like the suits in a bridge game. As she reached her cottage, a thought struck her. Forbes' headache that evening feigned, perhaps, to avoid playing, or a symptom of something else. The puzzle deepened, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. Chapter 4. Hidden Motives. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen on the dew-kissed hedgerows, but the village was far from its usual tranquility. News of Reginald Forbes' death had spread like wildfire through the narrow lanes, whispered in the post office, debated at the bakery, and dissected over teacups in every parlour. The vicarage, once a beacon of quiet respectability, was now the epicentre of scandal, its oak-panelled drawing room sealed off by Inspector Slack's orders, the bridge table still strewn with cards frozen in their final play. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her rose-covered cottage, sipped her morning tea, her knitting untouched on the table beside her. Her mind, however, was far from idle, turning over the events of the previous night with the precision of a card player analyzing a lost trick. The village buzzed with speculation. Some swore Forbes had been a swindler, his charm a mask for deceit. Others whispered of old grudges, debts unpaid, or secrets buried in his London past. Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that gossip held grains of truth amid its chaff, listened quietly as her maid, Florence, relayed the morning's talk. "They're saying he owed money all over, Miss," Florence said, polishing the silver with vigour, "and that Mrs. Price had a score to settle on account of her husband's troubles." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to a village seamstress who had once spread rumours to deflect her own guilt. Gossip, she knew, could obscure as much as it revealed by mid-morning. Miss Marple decided to call on Dolly Bantry, whose nervous chatter at the vicarage had hinted at more than mere shock. The Bantry house, a rambling manor on the village's edge, was a study in contrasts, the Colonel's military order clashing with Dolly's penchant for frilly curtains and overstuffed cushions. Dolly welcomed Miss Marple with a strained smile, her blonde curls slightly dishevelled, her hands fluttering as she poured tea. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she said, her voice high and brittle. "Arthur's beside himself, and I can't sleep for thinking of poor Mr. Forbes." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was keen, noting the way Dolly avoided her eyes, much like a schoolgirl caught fibbing about a broken vase. As they sat in the sunny drawing room, Dolly's words tumbled out. Forbes, she admitted, had been overly attentive, his compliments veering into boldness. He said I was wasted in the country, she confided, twisting a handkerchief. Said the first belonged in London, on his arm. Arthur overheard once and was furious. Miss Marple sipped her tea, recalling a young wife in the village who had been swayed by flattery, only to find herself entangled in scandal. "Did Mr. Forbes pursue you further?" she asked gently. Dolly flushed. "He tried, but I brushed him off. I love Arthur, you know that." Her protest was fervent, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in her voice, an echo of a parlour maid who had sworn fidelity while hiding love letters. The conversation turned to the bridge evening. Dolly insisted she had only left the room briefly, to fetch tea, but her timeline was vague. "It was just before the last hand," she said. "I was back in a moment." Miss Marple's mind ticked over the details. Forbes had poured his sherry during that same pause, his glass filled from the decanter. Had Dolly passed the sideboard? The question hung unasked, but Miss Marple filed it away, thinking of a case where a brief absence had masked a theft of jam tartsan, something far graver. Leaving the Bantrys, Miss Marple strolled toward the village green, where she encountered Mrs. Price walking her spaniel. The widow's elegance was undimmed, her silk scarf fluttering in the breeze, but her eyes were shadowed. "A terrible business," she said, pausing to greet Miss Marple. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing." Her tone was measured, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her lips, reminiscent of a shopkeeper who had denied knowledge of a stolen necklace. "You knew Mr. Forbes from before, I understand," Miss Marple ventured. Mrs. Price nodded curtly. "Our paths crossed through my husband's business. He was not always trustworthy." She offered no more, but Miss Marple sensed a deeper story, one perhaps tied to the letter Inspector Slack had found at the post office. Miss Marple gleaned more fragments of the village's mood. The postmistress, Miss Weatherby, was eager to share. "They say Forbes was mixed up in all sorts," she whispered, leaning over the counter. "Blackmail, some reckon. He had a way of knowing things." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to a village gossip who had used secrets as currency until her own were exposed. Miss Weatherby added that Forbes had received frequent letters from London, some marked urgent. "I don't read them, mind," she said primly, but her eyes gleamed with curiosity by afternoon. Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where Reverend Harrington was tending his roses, his face drawn. "I can't believe it happened here," he said, snipping a wilted bloom with unsteady hands. "He seemed so, alive." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, noting the vicar's unease. She asked about Forbes' visit the day before. "He spoke of a donation," Harrington said, his voice low, "but he hinted at knowing things about my past. Nothing specific, but unsettling." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, recalling a curate who had confessed a youthful folly under similar pressure. Dr. Ellis, encountered later at the chemist's, was less forthcoming, Slack's barking up the wrong tree with that digitalis. "Nonsense," he snapped, collecting a prescription. Forbes was healthy as a horse, bar his nerves. Miss Marple inquired gently about the missing digitalis bottle. "Stolen, I tell you," Ellis insisted. "I left my bag by the vicarage door. Anyone could have taken it." His defensiveness reminded Miss Marple of a doctor she had known, who had covered a mistake with bluster until the truth emerged. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window. Her knitting resumed, but her mind elsewhere. Forbes' death was no random act, she was certain. The blackmail letter, the missing digitalis, the strained alibis all pointed to motives buried deep. She thought of the bridge game, its partnerships and rivalries a microcosm of the village. Each player had a secret, she mused, much like the villagers in a long-ago theft of church silver, where every suspect had a hidden truth. Forbes, with his probing eyes and sharp tongue, had stirred those secrets, and one had proven fatal. The question was whose and how. As the church bells tolled, Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as the game itself. Chapter 5. The alibi crumbles. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and shadow, but the warmth of the August evening did little to dispel the chill that had settled over its inhabitants. The death of Reginald Forbes at the vicarage had cast a pall, and the once cozy lanes now thrummed with suspicion. Every glance exchanged at the butcher's or the grocer's carried an unspoken question: who had poisoned the newcomer? Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden with a cup of tea and her knitting, let her eyes wander over the roses, but her mind was far from the blooms. She was piecing together the fragments of the fatal bridge evening, each detail a card in a complex hand she was determined to play out. Inspector Slack, undeterred by the village's unease, pressed on with his investigation. His heavy boots were heard tramping to and fro, first to the vicarage, then to Forbes' rented cottage at Rose Lane, and finally to the homes of the bridge players. By noon, word reached Miss Marple via Florence, who had it from the milkman that Slack had taken a particular interest in Dr. Lionel Ellis. The missing bottle of digitalis, coupled with Forbes' symptoms, had made the doctor a prime suspect. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Digitalis, she knew, could cause convulsions. But Forbes' sudden collapse suggested something swifter, perhaps cyanide, as she had suspected. She recalled a case in the neighboring village of Much Benham, where a gardener's death had been blamed on heart failure, until a sharper eye uncovered a poisoned apple. Miss Marple decided to take her afternoon walk past the surgery, where Dr. Ellis was known to keep late hours. The surgery, a squat brick building with ivy creeping up its walls, stood near the village green, its windows dark save for a single light in the consultation room. As she approached, she saw Ellis through the glass, sorting papers with a distracted air. She tapped lightly on the door, and he started, his sharp green eyes narrowing before he recognized her. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped but civil. "What brings you here?" She smiled, her manner as disarming as ever. "Just a neighborly visit, Doctor. This dreadful business has us all on edge." Ellis invited her in, though his reluctance was palpable. The room smelled of antiseptic and old leather, a medical bag open on the desk, its contents in disarray. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to it, noting the absence of the digitalis bottle. "Inspector Slack seems convinced about that prescription," she remarked, settling into a chair. Ellis scowled. "He's a fool. That bottle was in my bag when I arrived at the vicarage. I set it down by the door. Anyone could have taken it during the game." His voice rose, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, reminiscent of a village clerk who had protested his innocence. While clutching a stolen ledger, she steered the conversation gently. "Mr. Forbes was your patient, I believe." Ellis nodded curtly. "He came to me about nerves, not his heart. Complained of sleeplessness, palpitations. I prescribed digitalis to calm him, but only a small dose." His fingers drummed at the desk, a nervous tick. Miss Marple tilted her head, and he questioned your diagnosis. Ellis's jaw tightened. He was impertinent, suggested I was out of my depth. "But I've been a doctor 30 years. Know my trade." His defensiveness, Miss Marple thought, was not unlike that of a chemist she had known, whose pride had masked a fatal error in a prescription. As she left the surgery, a new piece of information reached her ears, courtesy of a chance encounter with the vicarage gardener, Mr. Hodge. He was clipping hedges near the church, his weathered face creased with worry. "Terrible thing, miss," he said, pausing to wipe his brow. "I saw something odd that night, though I daren't tell the inspector yet." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained mild. "Do tell, Mr. Hodge. The smallest things can matter." He hesitated, then leaned closer. "I was passing the vicarage, tending the late roses, when I saw Dr. Ellis step outside, just for a moment, mind, during a break in the game. He looked about, then went back in." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to twitch of their own accord. "A brief absence," she mused, much like that of a choy boy who had slipped out to pilfer sweets, only to stumble on a darker deed. She thanked Mr. Hodge and continued her walk, her mind turning over this new thread. Ellis's absence, however brief, placed him near the sideboard where the sherry decanter stood. But why would he poison Forbes? A professional slight seemed thin motive for murder, yet pride, she knew, could drive men to desperate acts. She recalled a solicitor who had sabotaged a rival over a mere insult. His vengeance subtle but deadly dot. At the post office, Miss Marple learned more. Miss Weatherby, ever eager to share, mentioned a stranger seen near Forbes' cottage days before his death. A man in a dark coat, carrying a case. "Looked like a city type," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Not one of ours." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Forbes' London connections, hinted at in the blackmail letter, suggested enemies beyond St. Mary Mead. She thought of a travelling salesman whose business had masked a smuggling ring, uncovered only when a nosy neighbour noticed his late-night visitors. By evening, Miss Marple sat with Colonel and Dolly Bantry at their manor, invited for a light supper. The Colonel was subdued, his usual bluster dampened by Slack's relentless questions. "He thinks I had it in for Forbes," he grumbled, carving a joint with unnecessary force. "All because of that blasted investment. Forbes cost me thousands. But I wouldn't kill a man over it." Dolly, pale and fidgety, added, "Arthur was with me the whole time, except when I fetched the tea." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, seeking reassurance. Miss Marple smiled kindly, but noted the Colonel's flushed cheeks, so like those of a farmer who had denied a feud until a barn fire betrayed him as she walked home under the stars. Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to the bridge table. The game had been a battleground of egos, each player with a reason to resent Forbes. The vicar's past, Mrs. Price's debts, Ellis's pride, the Colonel's losses, Dolly's discomfortable, were cards in a deck that Forbes had shuffled with reckless skill. But the poison, she suspected, was not in the sherry alone. Something about Forbes collapsed the speed. The accusation suggested a deeper game. She recalled a village fete where a poisoned tart had been a distraction, the real weapon, a needle in a shawl. "The truth," she murmured, "is often misdoubt." As her cottage came into view, its windows glowing softly, Miss Marple resolved to watch and wait, certain that the next trick would reveal more of the killer's hand. Chapter 6. A surprising discovery. The following day dawned crisp and clear over St. Mary Mead, the kind of morning that promised renewal, but delivered only a heightened sense of unease among the villagers. The tragedy at the vicarage had rippled outward, turning casual conversations into hushed speculations and turning every glance into a potential accusation. Miss Jane Marple, ever the observer of human intricacies, spent her morning tending to her garden, her pruning shears snipping away deadheads with a rhythm that mirrored her methodical thoughts. The soil beneath her fingers was cool and yielding, much like the layers of deceit she suspected lay buried in Reginald Forbes' past. She had heard, through the reliable conduit of Florence's market errands, that Inspector Slack was delving into Forbes' belongings at Rose Cottage, a development that piqued her interest more than the blooming DAHLIAS. By midday, Miss Marple made her way to the cottage, a quaint stone dwelling nestled behind a screen of hollyhocks, its thatched roof sagging slightly under the weight of recent rains. The door stood ajar, guarded by Constable Perkins, who nodded respectfully as she approached. "Inspector's inside, miss," he said, his youthful face flushed with the gravity of his duty. Rummaging through the man's effects, Miss Marple smiled, faintly, her blue eyes twinkling with what might have been amusement. "I shan't disturb him long," she replied, stepping inside with the quiet assurance of one accustomed to uncovering hidden truths. The interior of Rose Cottage was a study in contrasts, Forbes' London sophistication clashing with the rustic charm of beamed ceilings and chintz curtains. Inspector Slack was in the sitting room, his broad form bent over a writing desk, papers scattered like fallen leaves. He straightened at her entrance, his mustache twitching in irritation. "Miss Marple," he grunted, not unkindly. "Come to offer your insights, have you?" She inclined her head modestly. "Merely a neighborly concern, Inspector." Mr. Forbes was, after all, a recent addition to our little community. Slack harumphed, but his eyes betrayed a grudging respect. He had learned, through past encounters, that this elderly spinster's observations often cut deeper than his own blunt inquiries. As Slack resumed his search, Miss Marple's gaze roamed the room. Bookshelves held volumes on finance and travel, their spines cracked from use, suggesting a man of worldly ambitions. A photograph on the mantel caught her eye, Forbes, younger and dashing, arm in arm with a woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Lavinia Price. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Connections, she knew, were like threads in a tapestry, often leading to unexpected patterns. She recalled a faded portrait in the attic of a village widow, which had revealed a long-buried affair and a motive for arson. Slack's voice broke her reverie. "Found his will here," he said, waving a document. "Leaves everything to a niece in Londonese of Forbes. Not much to leave, mind some stocks, a bit of cash. But look at this." He pried open a small safe hidden behind a painting, its door yielding with a click. Inside lay a velvet pouch, which Slack appended onto the desk. Jewels tumbled out. A ruby necklace, emerald earrings, a diamond brooch glinting in the sunlight. "Stolen goods," Miss Marple murmured, leaning closer. Slack nodded. "Likely. I'll check with the yard." But before he could say more, a shadow fell. Across the threshold, Mrs. Price, her face pale as she entered unannounced. "I heard you were here," she said breathlessly, her eyes locking on the jewels. "Those ... that brooch. It was mine, lost years ago in Calcutta. My husband gave it to me on our anniversary." Her hand trembled as she pointed, her composure cracking like fine china. Forbes must have stolen it or known who did. Slack's eyes sharpened. "You never mentioned this before." Mrs. Price shook her head. "I thought it gone forever. But if Forbes had it... Her voice trailed off, implications hanging heavy in the air. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the mix of shock and fury. reminiscent of a housekeeper who had discovered a pilfered heirloom in a servant's trunk, leading to confessions of deeper thefts. Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple pondered this revelation. Forbes, as a thief, added a new layer to the puzzle, his charm perhaps a facade for criminal pursuits. But why bring stolen jewels to a quiet village, and how did they connect to his death? She made her way to the vicarage, where the bridge table had been cleared, but the score sheet preserved by Slack's orders. Reverend Harrington, looking haggard, allowed her to examine it. Such a trivial thing now, he sighed. But Miss Marple's fingers traced the entries with care. The handwriting during the early hands was neat, matching the players' styles. Harrington's looping script, Ellis's precise strokes, Mrs. Price's flourish, Bantry's bold dashes. But in the fatal hand, the notations wavered. The numbers slanted oddly, as if written by a different hand. Someone else dealt these cards, Miss Marple whispered to herself, her mind flashing to the Enderby forgery, where a substituted signature had exposed a will tampering and a hidden murderer, who might have switched the score sheet or impersonated. The dealer, Forbes, had observed, but perhaps he had interfered, his meddling fatal dot. As afternoon waned, Miss Marple visited the churchyard, where ancient headstones leaned like gossiping elders. There, she encountered Colonel Bantry, pacing near a family plot. "Can't shake it off," he admitted gruffly. "Forbes and his blasted secrets." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, steering the talk to the jewels. Bantry's eyes widened. "Stolen? You say? He tried to sell me some investments, perhaps fencing goods." His voice dropped. "I turned him down, but if he thought I knew... ... Double quotes. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. Rejection could breed resentment, much like a spurned suitor who had poisoned a rival's wine in a tale from her youth. Dolly Bantry, met later at the manor, was equally unsettled. "Those jewels horrible," she said, her hands twisting a scarf. "Forbes gave me a pendant once, said it was a trinket. I threw it away." Her cheeks flushed, and Miss Marple noted the lie in her eyes, akin to a debutante hiding a forbidden gift. Perhaps Dolly had kept it, a token that now implicated her. Evening brought a telegram from London, the jewels confirmed stolen from various estates. Forbes suspected in a ring. Slack shared this over tea at Miss Marple's cottage, his frustration evident, motive aplenty, but who struck? Miss Marple smiled enigmatically. The discovery of theft often unmasks the thief and, sometimes, the avenger. As Slack departed, she sat by the fire, her knitting resuming its click. The jewels were a key, but the handwriting on the score sheet hinted at sleight of hand during the game itself. Forbes' death, she suspected, was tied to a betrayal at the table, where partnerships dissolved into peril. The puzzle tightened, each revelation a step closer to the truth hidden in St. Mary Mead's serene facade. Chapter 7. The niece appears. The village of St. Mary Mead, though bathed in the gentle light of another August morning, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next revelation to disturb its uneasy calm. The death of Reginald Forbes had woven a thread of suspicion through the community, and every conversation, from the butcher's counter to the church porch, carried the weight of unspoken theories. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a plate of scones, listened to Florence's latest report from the village grapevine. "They're saying a woman's come to Rose Cottage," Florence said, her eyes wide with excitement. "A niece of Mr. Forbes, from London. Arrived last night, bold as brass." Miss Marple's delicate hands paused over her teacup, her mind already turning. "A niece," she mused, was a new player in this intricate game, much like the unexpected arrival of a cousin in the Carstairs affair, who had brought with her a key to a long-buried scandal by mid-morning. Miss Marple set out for Rose Cottage, her black handbag swinging gently at her side, her shawl draped against the slight chill of the breeze. The village was abuzz, with knots of neighbours lingering near the green, their glances darting toward the cottage. As she approached, she saw a young woman standing at the gate, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun, her tailored coat marking her as a city dweller. She was perhaps 30, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to take the measure of everything they saw. "You must be Miss Marple," the woman said, her voice crisp but not unfriendly. "I'm Eliza Forbes, Reginald's niece. The village speaks highly of you." Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes twinkling with quiet assessment. "I'm merely a neighbour, my dear, come to offer condolences." Eliza invited her inside, where the cottage bore signs of recent disturbance, drawers ajar, papers stacked haphazardly, evidence of Inspector Slack's thorough search. Over tea, Eliza spoke, with a composure that belied her supposed grief. "I hadn't seen Uncle Reginald in years," she said, stirring her cup. "He wrote occasionally, promising me an inheritance, but always with conditions. Stay away, don't meddle in his affairs." Her lips curved slightly, a smile that held no warmth. "He was a secretive man." Miss Marple nodded, noting the calculating edge in Eliza's tone, reminiscent of a governess who had played innocent while hiding stolen letters. "And yet you came," she observed gently. Eliza's eyes flicked up. "I heard of his death. I had to settle his affairs." Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's arrival, his heavy tread announcing him before he appeared. "Miss Forbes," he said, his notebook at the ready. "A word about your uncle." Eliza met his gaze unflinchingly, repeating her story. She had been in London the night of the murder, attending a theatre performance, her ticket stub proof of her absence. Slack grunted, jotting it down. "We'll check that," he said, his skepticism plain. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the faint flush on Eliza's cheeks, a telltale sign she had seen in a shopgirl who had fabricated an alibi to cover a theft. As Slack questioned Eliza about her uncle's enemies, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the bridge evening. Forbes had chosen to observe, not play, citing a headache, yet his keen interest in the game suggested otherwise. Had he been watching for something specific? A slip, a signal, a secret revealed in the heat of play? She recalled a village whist drive where a player's hesitation had betrayed a hidden affair, the cards a mirror to deeper truths. Eliza's arrival, she suspected, was no coincidence. The promise of an inheritance could stir motives as potent as those that had driven a nephew to poison his uncle's brandy in a case long past. Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple walked to the village hall where the Women's Institute was preparing for a flower show. There, she found Mrs. Lavinia Price arranging roses, her hands steady but her face drawn. "That niece of his," Mrs. Price said, unprompted. "She's trouble. I saw her type in Calcutta sharp as a tack, always scheming." Miss Marple murmured agreement, noting the venom in her tone, akin to a landlady who had denounced a rival to mask her own misdeeds. "Did you know her before?" she asked. Mrs. Price shook her head. "Only by reputation. Forbes mentioned her once, said she was too clever for her own good." The words lingered, a clue to a deeper connection, perhaps, like the whispered rumours that had unravelled a smuggling ring in St. Mary Mead's past at the vicarage. Miss Marple found Reverend Harrington in his study, surrounded by books and sermon notes. His eyes were shadowed, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "That young woman came by," he said, unprompted. "Asked about my talks with Forbes. Seemed to know more than she let on." Miss Marple tilted her head. "About his donation, perhaps." Harrington flushed. She hinted at ... other matters. Things Forbes knew about me. His voice dropped, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to a curate who had confessed to a youthful theft under the pressure of a similar inquiry. By evening, Miss Marple sat with Dolly Bantry at the manor, where the talk turned to Eliza. "She's so poised," Dolly said, her voice tinged with envy. "But I don't trust her. Forbes was always writing to someone, maybe her." Miss Marple noted the jealousy, reminiscent of a debutante who had envied a rival's charm, only to discover it hid a darker intent. Colonel Bantry, joining them, added gruffly, "Forbes said his niece was his heir, but only if she kept her distance. Sounds like she didn't." His words echoed a farmer's warning about a wayward heir who had returned to claim more than his due. As Miss Marple walked home, the village settling into twilight, she pondered Eliza's role. The theatre alibi was too convenient, too neatly presented, like a forged receipt in the case of a pilfered church collection. Forbes' secrecy, his insistence on distance, suggested he feared his niece or what she knew. The jewels, the blackmail letter, the wavering handwriting on the scoresheet all pointed to a web of deceit, with Eliza, a possible spider, at its center. Yet Miss Marple sensed another layer, a hidden motive that Forbes had perhaps underestimated. "People," she murmured, "are so often blind to those closest to them." Her cottage loomed ahead, its windows a beacon in the dusk, and she resolved to watch Eliza closely, certain that this new player held a card that could trump the entire game. Chapter 8. Shadows of the Past. The late summer dusk draped St. Mary Mead in a veil of soft violet, the village's usual serenity fractured by the lingering spectre of Reginald Forbes' death. The vicarage tragedy had become the heartbeat of local gossip, each villager adding their own flourish to the tale, from whispered theories of revenge to tales of cursed wealth. Miss Jane Marple, walking home from evensong, her black shoes tapping lightly on the cobbled path, let the murmurs wash over her. Her mind, sharp as the thorns on the roses she passed, was piecing together the mosaic of motives that Forbes' arrival and departure had unearthed. The evening sermon on forgiveness had struck her as ironic, given the grudges that seemed to pulse beneath the village's calm surface. By morning, Miss Marple resolved to visit Colonel Bantry, whose wartime history with Forbes had surfaced. As a potential motive, the Bantry manor, with its sprawling lawns and ivy-clad walls, stood in contrast to the turmoil within. The colonel greeted her in his study, a room lined with military books and faded maps, his mustache bristling with barely concealed agitation. "Slack's been hounding me," he grumbled, pouring tea with a hand that shook slightly. "Thinks I poisoned Forbes over some bad investments. Utter rot." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes noting the strain in his ruddy face, reminiscent of a gamekeeper who had denied poaching until a hidden trap betrayed him. She steered the conversation to the war years. "Mr. Forbes mentioned investments, I believe," she asked gently. The colonel's jaw tightened. "He was a profiteer, that's what. Pushed bonds on me during the war, said they'd fund munitions, make me rich. Lost half my savings when they crashed." His voice grew heated. "I confronted him last week, here in this room. He laughed it off, said it was business. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to a merchant who had swindled a widow, his bravado masking a deeper guilt. "And you reconciled?" she prompted. Bantry hesitated. "Of a sort. He offered to make good, but I didn't trust him. Told him to keep his distance." His eyes met hers, then slid away, and she noted the evasion, much like that of a tenant who had dodged questions about a stolen rent. Leaving the manor, Miss Marple encountered Dolly Bantry in the garden, her blonde curls wilting under a wide-brimmed hat. "Arthur's been so cross," Dolly confided, snipping roses with unsteady hands. "He came home that day after, seeing Forbes smelling of sherry. I thought he'd been drinking, but he swore he hadn't." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Sherry, she mused, was a curious detail, given Forbes' final accusation. She recalled a housemaid who had sworn her mistress drank only tea, only for a hidden flask to reveal the truth. "Did you notice anything odd at the vicarage?" she asked. Dolly shook her head, but her fingers twisted the rose stems, a gesture Miss Marple associated with a girl hiding a forbidden romance. At the surgery, Dr. Ellis was no less forthcoming. Miss Marple found him sterilizing instruments, his movements brisk and precise. "Slack's obsessed with that digitalis," he said, not looking up. "But I told you, Forbes' issue was nerves, not his heart. I prescribed it to calm him. Nothing lethal." Miss Marple tilted her head, and yet the bottle vanished. Ellis's hands paused, his green eyes flashing. "Someone took it. I left my bag by the door. Harrington, Price, any of them could have slipped it out." His insistence reminded her of a chemist who had blamed a theft on a careless assistant, only for the truth to point inward. A visit to the vicarage revealed Reverend Harrington in the vestry, sorting hymnals with a distracted air. "This business has shaken us all," he said, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Miss Marple inquired about Forbes' visit before the bridge evening. "He spoke of a donation," Harrington said, his voice low, "but then he mentioned my past, a youthful indiscretion, nothing criminal, but shameful." His hands trembled, and Miss Marple thought of a curate who had confessed to a long-ago theft under the weight of a similar accusation. "Did he threaten you?" she asked softly. Harrington shook his head, but his eyes were haunted. He hinted he knew more than he should. By afternoon, Miss Marple learned from the postmistress, Miss Weatherby, that Forbes had received a letter marked urgent days before his death, postmarked London. "Thick envelope," Miss Weatherby said, her curiosity barely veiled. "Looked official." Miss Marple filed this away, recalling a solicitor's letter that had sparked a murder when its contents were revealed. The letter, combined with Eliza Forbes' arrival, suggested a London connection that Forbes had kept hidden, much like a smuggler who had used coded messages to conceal his trade. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting needles clicking softly. The Colonel's wartime grudge, Dolly's sherry-scented tale, Ellis's missing bottle, Harrington's shame-all were threads in a web that Forbes had spun with reckless confidence. The jewels, the blackmail letter, the wavering score-sheet, and now Eliza's poised presence pointed to a deeper game. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a village scandal where a man's past had returned to haunt him, his secrets exposed by a careless word. Forbes, she suspected, had stirred old wounds, and one had bled fatally. "The past," she murmured, "has a way of dealing a deadly hand." As the fire crackled, she resolved to probe further, certain that the shadows of yesterday held the key to today's crime. Chapter 9. The twist unfolds. The village of St. Mary Mead, though bathed in the soft glow of an August afternoon, seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of unease. as if the very cobblestones whispered of secrets yet to be uncovered. The death of Reginald Forbes had tightened its grip on the community, each villager's glance carrying a shadow of doubt, each conversation laced with the question of who had struck the fatal blow. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with her knitting, idle in her lap, gazed out at the garden, where bees hummed among the late roses. Her mind, however, was far from the tranquillity of her blooms, weaving through the tangled threads of motive and opportunity that had emerged since the bridge. Club tragedy. Inspector Slack's investigation had taken a decisive turn. By midday, word reached Miss Marple through Florence, who had overheard it at the grocer's, that Colonel Arthur Bantry had been taken into custody. The evidence, Slack claimed, was compelling. The Colonel's wartime grudge against Forbes, his admitted confrontation, and the faint trace of sherry on his breath, as reported by Dolly, all pointed to opportunity and motive. The digitalis, though not confirmed as the poison, was a damning link. Given its presence in Dr. Ellis's bag, which the Colonel could have accessed during the game, Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she sipped her tea. The case against Bantry was neat to neat, she thought, recalling a village poacher whose obvious guilt had masked a subtler crime, determined to test her suspicions. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where the air still carried the faint scent of lavender, polish and tragedy. Reverend Harrington, pale and distracted, allowed her to examine the scene once more, under the watchful eye of Constable Perkins. The bridge table stood as it had been, the cards now sealed in evidence bags, but the sideboard drew her attention. The sherry decanter, confiscated for analysis, had left a faint ring on the polished wood. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the surface, noting a smudge near the edge of a fingerprint, perhaps, or a trace of something else. She bent closer, her shawl brushing the table, and saw that the smudge was not one, but several, overlapping in a pattern that suggested multiple hands. Curious, she murmured, thinking of a stolen brooch case where fingerprints on a jewel box had pointed to an unexpected culprit. She requested the score sheet, which Perkins produced reluctantly. The wavering handwriting from the fatal hand stood out starkly against the earlier entries, its slanted numbers suggesting haste or deceit. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the Enderby forgery, where a falsified document had unravelled a murderdish brown murder. Someone else wrote this, she said softly, her fingers tracing the ink. Not Forbes, nor any of the players. Perkins frowned but said nothing, and Miss Marple tucked the thought away, certain it held a key to the killer's sleight. Of hand, her next stop was the Bantry manor, where Dolly was pacing the drawing room, her face pale and her hands wringing a handkerchief. "They've taken Arthur," she cried, her voice breaking. "It's a mistake, Miss Marple. He's no murderer." Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes gentle but searching. "Tell me, my dear, about that sherry you mentioned. You said Arthur smelled of it that day." Dolly nodded, tears welling. "After his meeting with Forbes, I thought he'd been drinking, but he said it was just a toast to settle their quarrel." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. A toast, she mused, could be a cover for something darker, much like a shared cup of tea that had once concealed a poison in a village scandal. The conversation turned to Eliza Forbes, whose poised demeanour had intrigued Miss Marple. "That niece of his," Dolly said, her voice sharp with dislike. "She was at the cottage this morning, sorting papers. Said she was in London that night, but I don't believe her." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Eliza's theatre alibi. A quick visit to the post office confirmed a crack in that story. Miss Weatherby, ever vigilant, revealed that the London theatre in question had cancelled its performance that night due to a lead actor's illness. No show at all, she said, triumphantly, that Miss Forbes lied. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A false alibi was like a dropped stitch in a carefully knitted lie, ready to unravel the whole pattern. Confronted later at Rose Cottage, Eliza maintained her composure, though her sharp eyes flickered with unease. "I must have mixed up the dates," she said smoothly, when pressed about the theatre. "I was at a friend's flat, dining," but her hands betrayed her, clenching tightly. A gesture Miss Marple associated with a shopgirl, caught in a lie about a stolen shawl. "You visited your uncle that day, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eliza's face hardened. "I came to St. Mary Mead briefly, yes, to discuss his will. But I left hours before the bridge game." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple sensed a crack in her armor, akin to a governess who had confessed to theft under gentle probing. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. The Colonel's arrest felt premature, a move born of Slack's impatience rather than proof. The fingerprints on the sideboard, the wavering score sheet, Eliza's false alibi all pointed to a deeper deception. She recalled a case where a man's death had been blamed on an obvious suspect, only for a hidden accomplice to emerge from the shadows. Forbes' accusation of the sherry, she suspected, was a misdirection, perhaps to protect someone or to conceal a different method. The jewels, the blackmail letter, the wartime grudges, each was a card, but the trump card lay in the timing of that fatal hand. "Someone played a false card," she murmured, her needles pausing, "and it cost Forbes his life." As the firelight danced, Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened, certain that the next revelation would expose the killer's hand. Chapter 10. Deeper Deception. The twilight of St. Mary Mead was soft and deceptive, cloaking the village in a hush that belied the storm of suspicion brewing within its borders. The arrest of Colonel Bantry had sent ripples through the community, with neighbours whispering of wartime vendettas and poisoned sherry, while the vicarage stood silent, its once welcoming windows darkened by the shadow of murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cosy parlour with a shawl about her shoulders, let her knitting lie idle as she sipped her evening tea. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as ever, gazed into the fire, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the layers of deceit that Reginald Forbes' death had exposed. The puzzle was intricate, each clue a card in a game where the stakes were life and death, and she sensed the truth lay not in the obvious but in the subtle misplays. The morning brought fresh developments. Florence, returning from the market with a basket of vegetables and a wealth of gossip, reported that Inspector Slack was now focusing on the poison itself. The police surgeon's report, she said, had ruled out digitalis. Forbes' collapse, cyanosis, and convulsions pointed to cyanide, a swift and merciless killer. "They're saying it wasn't in the sherry at all," Florence whispered, her eyes wide. "The glass was clean, but they found traces in his cigarette case." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, her thoughts flashing to a village fate, where a poisoned sweet had been mistaken for a harmless treat, the true method hidden in a mundane act. Cyanide in a cigarette, she mused, was a devilishly clever trick, requiring access and intent. Determined to explore this new thread, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where Reverend Harrington was polishing the silver in a futile attempt to restore normalcy. His hands shook as he greeted her, his spectacles fogging slightly. "The police took everything," he said, gesturing to the sideboard, now bare of its decanter. Even my cigarette case, though I told them I offered it to Forbes that night. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. You shared your cigarettes with him? Harrington nodded, his face pale. He asked for one during the break, when he went for the sherry. I keep them in a silver case, family heirloom. His voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the tremor. Reminiscent of a choy boy who had confessed to stealing candles after a similar act of sharing. She asked to see the bridge table again, and Harrington obliged, leading her to the drawing room. The score sheet, now returned from evidence, lay under glass, its wavering handwriting a silent accusation. Miss Marple studied it, her fingers tracing the air above the numbers. This hand, she said softly, was not written by Forbes or any player. Someone else took the pen. Harrington frowned, puzzled. But Miss Marple's mind raced to a case where a forged diary entry had revealed a murderer's intent. The cigarette, the score sheet, the sherriel were pieces of a misdirection, she suspected, designed to obscure the killer's true move at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple found Eliza Forbes sorting through her uncle's papers, her sharp features set in concentration. Inspector Slack thinks I lied about London, Eliza said, her voice cool but defensive. But I was only protecting my privacy. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes noting the neat stack of letters, some bearing London postmarks. Your uncle was a secretive man, she remarked. Eliza's hands paused. He had enemies, business rivals, creditors. He told me to stay away, said it was safer. Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear, akin to a governess who had fled a scandal only to face it anew. A chance encounter with Dr. Ellis at the village green added another layer. Cyanide, not digitalis, he said brusquely, adjusting his hat. I told Slack that bottle of mine was irrelevant. Someone planted the idea to frame me. His green eyes flashed with indignation, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, like that of a pharmacist who had protested innocence while hiding a tampered vial. You were outside during the break, she said gently, recalling the gardener's tale. Ellis stiffened. Just for air. I saw nothing. His denial was firm, but Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a case where a brief absence had masked a theft of arsenic from a shed by evening. Miss Marple called on Dolly Bantry, who was pacing the manor's drawing room, her blonde curls in disarray. Arthur's innocent, she insisted, her voice breaking. But Slack won't listen. And that Eliza she was here yesterday, asking about Arthur's row with Forbes. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Eliza's probing suggested more than curiosity, perhaps a bid to shift blame. Dolly's mention of the sherry on Arthur's breath lingered in Miss Marple's mind, a detail that clashed with the cyanide finding. She recalled a village scandal where a man's breath had betrayed not drink, but a chemical used to lace a rival's pipe as night fell. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts racing. The cyanide in the cigarette was a masterstroke, requiring proximity and precision. Harrington's case, offered so casually, was the perfect vehicle, but his nervousness suggested fear, not guilt. Eliza's false alibi and probing questions hinted at deeper involvement, while Ellis's absence and the Colonel's grudge added complexity. The score sheet's false hand, she suspected, was the key, a deliberate act to confuse the timeline, much like a forged ledger in a theft case that had pointed to an accomplice. The killer played a hidden card, she murmured, her needles clicking, but the trick was too clever by half. As the firelight flickered, Miss Marple resolved to unravel the deception, certain that the truth lay in the shadows of that fatal hand. Chapter 11. The ultimate twist. The air in St. Mary Mead carried a restless edge, as if the village itself sensed the unravelling of its latest scandal. The soft glow of gas lamps lit the lanes, but their warmth could not dispel the chill of suspicion that lingered after Reginald Forbes' death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with her knitting needles, silent, gazed into the fire, her mind a whirl of connections and contradictions. The cyanide in Forbes' cigarette, the wavering score-sheet, Eliza's false alibi, and the web of motives among the bridge players formed a pattern as intricate as the lace she crafted. She knew the truth was close, hidden in the subtle mist of that fatal evening, and she resolved to lay the cards on the table by morning. Miss Marple requested a gathering at the vicarage, a request Inspector Slack grudgingly allowed, sensing her knack for uncovering what he missed. The drawing room, still heavy with the memory of death, was arranged as it had been. The bridge table at the centre, chairs drawn up, the sideboard bare but for a single lamp. Reverend Harrington, pale and fidgeting, welcomed the group with a forced smile. Dr. Ellis stood stiffly, his green eyes wary. Mrs. Lavinia Price, her silk dress immaculate, sat with poised detachment. Colonel Bantry, released on bail but shadowed by suspicion, gripped his wife's hand, while Dolly's eyes darted nervously. Eliza Forbes, summoned from Rose Cottage, stood apart, her sharp features unreadable. Slack loomed by the door, his notebook ready, his skepticism palpable. Miss Marple began, her voice soft but commanding attention. "A game of bridge," she said, "is like life, full of partnerships, risks, and hidden moves. Mr. Forbes' death was no accident, but a carefully played hand with cyanide as the trump card." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. The sherry was a ruse, as the police confirmed. The poison was in his cigarette, taken from Reverend Harrington's case. Harrington started, his spectacles slipping. "I offered it in good faith," he stammered. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, but someone tampered with it." She turned to the score-sheet, now displayed on the table. "This hand," she said, pointing to the wavering numbers, "was not written by any player. Someone else marked it to confuse the timeline." Her gaze settled on Eliza. "Miss Forbes, your alibi was false. The theatre was dark that night." Eliza's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, "You visited your uncle earlier, perhaps to confront him about the jewels or the will." Eliza's eyes flashed. "I came to talk, yes, but I left long before the game." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, seemed to twitch. "Let us consider the motives," she said. "Colonel Bantry, you lost money to Forbes schemes. Dr. Ellis, he insulted your skill. Mrs. Price, he held a debt over you. Reverend Harrington, he knew of a past indiscretion." Each face tightened, but Miss Marple's voice grew softer. "Yet the cigarette suggests a personal act, one requiring access and trust." She turned to Harrington. "Your case was a family heirloom, you said. Who else handled it?" Harrington's face drained of colour. "No one," he whispered, but his hands shook. Miss Marple's eyes softened with pity. "You and Forbes were connected, weren't you? Not just by theology, but by blood." A gasp rippled through the room. Slack leaned forward, his pencil poised. "Forbes was your half-brother," Miss Marple said gently. "Abandoned in youth, he returned to claim a share of a family fortune you inherited. He threatened to expose you, to ruin your life here." Harrington crumpled, his voice breaking. He was bitter, cruel. Said I'd stolen his birthright. I laced a cigarette with cyanide, meaning to use it myself, to escape his blackmail. His confession hung heavy, but Miss Marple shook her head. You didn't kill him. Forbes took the wrong cigarette, didn't he? In haste, during the break, he grabbed the one meant for you. Harrington nodded, tears streaming. I couldn't stop him. But Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Eliza. You knew, she said. You supplied the cyanide, forged the score. Sheet to muddle the timeline, and lied about your alibi to protect your uncle's plan and your inheritance. Eliza's composure cracked, her sharp eyes blazing. He deserved it, she spat. He cheated me, too promised me everything, then threatened to cut me out. Slack stepped forward, his cuffs ready, as Eliza's defiance faltered. Miss Marple sighed, her knitting resumed. Forbes' own paranoia was his undoing. He suspected a trap, switched cigarettes to frame someone, perhaps you, Reverend, but took the poisoned one by mistake. A tragic misdeal. The room fell silent, the truth settling like dust. Slack, grudgingly impressed, escorted Eliza and Harrington away, while the others dispersed, their secrets laid bare. As Miss Marple walked home, the village quiet under the stars, she thought of a long-ago card game where a cheat had been caught by a single misplaced ace. Human nature, she murmured, is the trickiest opponent of all. Her cottage glowed ahead, a haven where she would knit and wait for the next hand life dealt. Chapter 12. Resolution. The dawn broke gently over St. Mary Mead, its golden light filtering through the mist that clung to the meadows, softening the edges of a village shaken by recent revelations. The arrest of Reverend Harrington and Eliza. Forbes had quelled the storm of gossip, but a quiet unease lingered, as if the cobblestones themselves mourned the loss of innocence. The vicarage, once a beacon of community, stood subdued, its windows shuttered, while the bridge club's future hung uncertain. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a fresh pot of tea, let her knitting rest as she reflected on the intricate hand that had been played out. Her pale blue eyes, ever watchful, saw beyond the surface calm, tracing the threads of human folly that had led to Reginald Forbes' demise. The morning papers, delivered by Florence with a mix of awe and chatter, confirmed the details. Harrington, broken by guilt, had confessed fully his plan to end his own life with a cyanide-laced cigarette, driven by Forbes' relentless blackmail over a shared inheritance. Eliza, complicit in supplying the poison and forging the score sheet, had hoped to secure her uncle's wealth, her false alibi a desperate bid to evade suspicion. Yet Forbes, ever cunning, had inadvertently taken the poisoned cigarette meant for Harrington, his paranoia leading to his own accidental death. The irony, Miss Marple mused, was as sharp as the cyanide itself, reminiscent of a village swindler who had fallen into his own trap years ago. By mid-morning, Miss Marple strolled to the Bantry manor to check on Dolly, whose nerves had frayed under the strain of her husband's brief arrest. The manor's drawing room was bright with summer flowers, but Dolly's face was pale, her blonde curls limp. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Arthur's cleared, but I can't stop thinking of that night." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch gentle but her eyes keen. "The truth, my dear, often brings relief, though it stings at first." She noted Dolly's lingering unease, akin to a housemaid who had feared exposure long after a theft was forgiven. Colonel Bantry, joining them, was gruff but grateful. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple," he said, his mustache twitching. Slack would have had me in chains without you." Miss Marple smiled modestly, deflecting praise. "I only saw what was there, Colonel. People reveal themselves, if you watch closely." Her words echoed a lesson from a long-ago case, where a farmer's boast had unraveled a plot to poison livestock at the vicarage. Mrs. Lavinia Price was helping to clear the drawing room, her silk dress a stark contrast to the somber task. "I never trusted Forbes," she admitted, arranging chairs with care. "But to think he caused such ruin... Her voice held a note of relief, and Miss Marple noted the absence of her usual guardedness, much like a widow who had shed a burden after a blackmailer's fall. "The jewels?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Price nodded. "Returned to me, thank heavens, though I'd rather forget the whole affair." Her words carried a finality that Miss Marple understood, recalling a stolen heirloom case where closure had healed old wounds. Dr. Lionel Ellis, met later at the surgery, was brusque but subdued. "I misjudged Forbes' symptoms," he admitted, cleaning his spectacles. "Thought it was nerves, not poison. Slack's off my back now, thanks to you." Miss Marple inclined her head, noting his softened tone, like that of a chemist who had learned humility after a near-fatal error. "We all misjudge at times," she said, her thoughts on a doctor whose pride had once masked a dangerous oversight. By evening, the bridge club reconvened tentatively in the village hall, a neutral ground free of the vicarage's ghosts. The players, minus Harrington, who awaited trial, moved cautiously, their bid subdued, their laughter forced. Miss Marple joined them, her knitting needles clicking softly, her presence a quiet anchor. "We must go on," she said, her voice gentle but firm, as she led with a careful 2 hearts. The others nodded, their cards a bridge to normalcy, though their eyes still held the shadow of betrayal. Inspector Slack, stopping by to observe, grumbled about meddling old ladies, but tipped his hat to Miss Marple. "You've a knack." "I'll give you that," he said, his notebook tucked away. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Human nature, Inspector, is much the same everywhere, full of unexpected turns, like a misdealt hand at bridge." Her words, light as they seemed, carried the weight of countless village secrets she had unraveled, from stolen silver to hidden loves. As she walked home under a starlit sky, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Forbes' death, a tragic misstep in a game of greed and guilt, had exposed the fragility of trust. Each player, Harrington, Eliza, the Colonel, Dolly, Mrs. Price, Ellis, had held a card. But Forbes had shuffled the deck too recklessly. She thought of a village whist game where a cheat's flourish had cost him dearly, a parallel to this darker hand. "Life," she murmured, "is a game of chance, but truth always trumps deceit." Her cottage glowed ahead, a haven of quiet certainty, where she would knit and wait, ever watchful for the next hand St. Mary Mead might deal.